February 23, 1791. Rain on the windows of the half-finished capital city. A fire burning low. The United States of America, barely 2 years old under its Constitution, is about to have its first constitutional crisis. George Washington sits alone in his study, reading. In front of him is a bill passed by Congress to create the first bank of the United States, Hamilton's Bank, the capstone of the financial system he has been building since 1789. The instrument that would, in Hamilton's vision, transform a bankrupt collection of quarreling states into a functioning economic power. Washington puts the papers down. He has heard from Thomas Jefferson. He has heard from James Madison, the man who wrote the Constitution, who sat in the room where it was drafted, who understands its intentions better than anyone alive. Both men have told Washington the same thing. The Constitution does not give Congress the power to create a bank. The bill is unconstitutional. If he signs it, he will be establishing a precedent that could turn the federal government into the unlimited monarchy they fought a revolution to escape. Their arguments are careful, precise, hard to refute. Washington calls for Hamilton. The younger man arrives, rain still on his coat, already reading Washington's expression. Washington is direct. Jefferson and Madison have made their case. The constitutional argument against the bank is strong. He is inclined to veto. Hamilton does not flinch. He asks for 48 hours. Washington studies him for a long moment. Then quietly, 48 hours. What Hamilton writes in those 2 days and 2 nights will not just save his bank, it will change the meaning of the Constitution forever and lay the legal foundation for every expansion of federal power in American history. To understand what Hamilton was fighting for, you have to understand where the country had been. The Revolutionary War had been won on borrowed money and broken promises. Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, could not tax, could not pay its debts, could not even reliably pay the soldiers who had won independence. States printed their own currencies, dozens of them, worthless almost immediately, destroying the savings of ordinary people and the credit of the nation itself. Foreign creditors, the French bankers who had financed the revolution, the Dutch lenders who had kept Washington's army alive, were watching the American experiment with growing contempt. The Constitution of 1787 was supposed to fix this, and Hamilton, as Washington's first Secretary of the Treasury, had moved immediately and aggressively to use it. His first report on public credit had funded the national debt at full value, a radical decision that restored American creditworthiness almost overnight. His assumption plan had taken on the state's war debts, creating the foundation of a national financial system. Bond markets were functioning, capital was flowing, but Hamilton knew the system was incomplete. What the country needed, what it needed to function as a modern economy rather than a collection of agricultural provinces, was a central bank. A Bank of the United States would hold government deposits and distribute funds efficiently. It would issue banknotes backed by specie, real, reliable currency that merchants and farmers could trust. It would provide the government with emergency credit when tax revenues fell short. It would create the stable financial infrastructure that commerce requires to grow. Hamilton had studied the Bank of England obsessively. He understood what made Britain powerful in the world. It wasn't the Navy, it wasn't the Empire. It was the credit system, the invisible financial architecture that allowed the British government to mobilize enormous resources quickly because everyone trusted it to repay. Congress passed the bank bill. It went to Washington's desk, and that's when the Constitutional War began. Thomas Jefferson's argument was elegant and deeply felt. The Constitution, he wrote in his formal opinion for Washington, is a compact of specifically limited powers. The federal government may do only what the document explicitly authorizes. Article 1, Section 8 lists the powers of Congress: to tax, to borrow, to regulate commerce, to coin money, to raise armies. A national bank does not appear on that list. Therefore, Congress has no power to create one. The necessary and proper clause, the provision that allows Congress to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out its enumerated powers, does not help Hamilton, Jefferson argued. Necessary means absolutely essential, indispensable, not merely convenient or useful. The government could collect taxes and regulate commerce without a bank. Therefore, the bank was not necessary. Therefore, it was unconstitutional. James Madison went further. He had been in the Constitutional Convention. He had written large portions of the document. If a national bank had been intended, he argued, it would have been included. The fact that it wasn't was not an oversight. It was a deliberate choice. The framers had considered and rejected a provision authorizing a national bank. Their vision of America was agrarian, decentralized, suspicious of concentrated financial power. They had seen what the Bank of England did to British society: the speculation, the financial aristocracy, the corruption of politics by money. They did not want that for America. And their constitutional argument was formidable. Madison, in particular, was not easy to dismiss. He had built the document. His reading of it carried enormous weight. Washington, who hated debt and feared disorder in equal measure, found himself genuinely persuaded. He sent word to Hamilton, 48 hours. Hamilton sat down at his Treasury desk and wrote without stopping. He had no research notes, no precedents to cite. There were none. He was inventing constitutional law in real time under a 2-day deadline, knowing that Washington's decision would set a precedent that could never be undone. He began with a question that seemed almost philosophical, but was in fact the foundation of everything. What is the Constitution? Jefferson and Madison read it as a list of permissions, specific, bounded, complete. If the power wasn't written down, it didn't exist. Hamilton read it differently. The Constitution was not a legislative act itemizing every action the government might take. It was a framework, a structure of government with certain express powers, and with those powers, the inherent authority to use all reasonable and appropriate means to carry them out. The key was the necessary and proper clause, the provision Jefferson had tried to narrow to absolute essentials. Hamilton seized it and expanded it. Necessary, he wrote, does not mean indispensable. It means useful, conducive, naturally related to the end. A thing may be necessary in the sense that it makes a legitimate governmental purpose more effective, and that is sufficient constitutional basis. If Congress has the power to tax, it must have the power to manage and deploy tax revenues effectively, which requires a bank. If it has the power to regulate commerce, it must have the tools to promote a stable commercial system, which requires a bank. If it has the power to borrow money, it must have the capacity to maintain its creditworthiness, which requires a bank. The bank was not an end in itself. It was a means, a necessary and proper means. To carry out powers the Constitution had explicitly granted. This was the doctrine of implied powers. The federal government possessed not only the powers expressly enumerated in the Constitution, but also the powers logically implied by those express powers, the tools necessary to make the express powers effective. Hamilton was not inventing power the Constitution didn't grant. He was identifying power the Constitution had always contained, but that Jefferson and Madison, in their fear of centralized authority, were refusing to acknowledge. 40 pages, 2 days, no sleep. When he finished, he sent it to Washington. Washington read every word. He was not a lawyer, he was a soldier, a farmer, a man who had spent his adult life fighting the consequences of financial chaos. He understood, viscerally, what it meant when governments couldn't pay their debts and currencies couldn't be trusted. He had heard Jefferson's warning: sign this, and you begin the road to unlimited federal power and eventual tyranny. He had heard Hamilton's counter: refuse to sign and you confirm that the federal government is too weak to do what governments must do, and the republic will fail for want of an effective financial system. Both arguments were genuine. Both men believed, deeply and sincerely, that the future of the republic depended on Washington seeing things their way. On February 25, 1791, 2 days after Hamilton asked for 48 hours, Washington signed the Bank Act into law. The first bank of the United States opened in Philadelphia. It began issuing credit, stabilizing currency, managing government finances with an efficiency that had never existed before. The American economy, fragile and uncertain in 1789, began to grow with new confidence. But the deeper consequence was constitutional. Hamilton's implied powers doctrine became embedded in American governance almost immediately. Chief Justice John Marshall would cite it explicitly in the landmark 1819 case McCulloch v. Maryland, upholding a second bank of the United States and declaring, in language that echoed Hamilton almost verbatim, that the Constitution was intended to endure and be adapted to the various crises of human affairs. That ruling made implied powers the permanent law of the land. From that foundation flowed everything. The Louisiana Purchase, which Jefferson himself justified using exactly the implied powers argument he had once condemned. The Civil War Draft, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Federal Reserve System, created in 1913, 122 years after Hamilton first argued for a central bank, the New Deal, the space program, Medicare. Every major expansion of federal authority in American history rests on the constitutional architecture Hamilton built in 48 hours. Jefferson never forgave him. The battle over the bank planted the seed of the first American political party system. Federalists against Democratic Republicans, Hamilton's vision against Jefferson's, a debate that is never entirely ended. But the Republic survived, and the Constitution became what Hamilton always insisted it must be. Not a document that bound the government to paralysis in the face of problems its framers could not predict, but a living framework, capable of growth, capable of adaptation, capable of governing a nation across centuries of change. The first Bank of the United States operated until 1811, when Congress refused to renew its charter. Within 2 years, the United States could not finance the War of 1812. A second bank was created in 1816. Andrew Jackson destroyed it in 1836. The financial instability that followed haunted the American economy for decades. In 1913, 122 years after Hamilton signed his opinion, Congress finally created a permanent central bank, the Federal Reserve. Hamilton had been right all along. He died in 1804, shot by Aaron Burr at dawn on the banks of the Hudson. He was 49 years old. He left behind a financial system, a constitutional doctrine, and an argument about the nature of government that Americans are still having. In a candlelit room in Philadelphia, in 48 hours of ferocious, sleepless writing, Alexander Hamilton did not just save his bank, he built the government. Next on Pivot Points. Britain had spent decades making it illegal. Illegal to export the machines. Illegal to share the designs. Illegal for anyone who knew the secret to leave. They were protecting the most valuable industrial knowledge in the world. And then a 21-year-old apprentice memorized every dimension, every gear, every mechanical secret they had, and sailed for America. What Samuel Slater carried in his head didn't just build one mill. It built an entire nation's industrial future. Samuel Slater, next on Pivot Points.